And the reason for that is that, I think, is that when a schizophrenic talks to you, when they rant and rave their possible or impossible delusion, if we want to call it that, they're trying to still convey at some levels a truth. They desperately want you to see things as they see it. There's a kind of epistemological value. You should know this. A rumor is simply about pleasure. It's not trying to sell you a truth. It's trying to sell you a pleasure, a sickly, vile pleasure, right? To be part of a network of insinuations, of basically what we're going to get to in the final thing. Rumors, ultimately, the fourth concept is that they're death wishes. Most of the time, it's a death wish. You are in name defaming someone or something, right? And therefore wishing ill. It's a malediction, to use a term from sorcery, right? Malediction meaning evil words, like a dark spell. And rumor absolutely has that magical quality to it. And I think that's why people are so willfully able to step into a rumor and become complicit in spreading a rumor the way they wouldn't a mad woman's delusion. You follow? Because it plays at a pleasure principle, not at a truth principle. So you don't even need to think about it because there's a sensorial pull or gravitational attraction to it. All right. So we had that suspicion, anonymity, circulatory power, and death wish. Those are the four elements of a rumor that I just wanted to isolate. And just very quickly for superstition. If you all recall in the very first session, I mentioned a phenomenon in video game culture called no-clipping, which is the idea of like slipping through the matrix of a game, of video game, into a kind of unfinished geometry, unfinished architecture, a layer or subcompartment of the game where now you're kind of stuck just wandering around. You can't get back to the surface of the actual game, but now you're kind of in the scaffolding, right? You're in the walls of the game in a somewhat semi-unprogrammed space, and that the new generation of video gamers refer to that now as God mode, are increasingly doing that, right? Which is amazing, the idea of this lost, wandering God. Again, for those who watch the show Westworld, there's a guy, the Man in Black, I think he's called, who kind of is this type of figure, who haunts the margins, who doesn't get consumed by the main story or drama, melodrama of Westworld and the simulation. Instead, he wants to go into the labyrinth, as he calls it, and discover the kind of underlying code worlds. So in a way, superstition too is a cheat code, right? It perceives reality, it perceives the universe, creation as a game that requires a cheat code. So it's a shortcut to an end. It's an alternative form of causality. So if the dominant pillars of society are operating through their political, economic, military, cultural logics, you have this one small exception that you can activate, right? This micro ritual that allows you sort of in your solitude to influence and distort reality. So it's a form of agency. Obviously, then those who would be Marx famously, as you all know, said that religion is the opiate of the masses, right? And there's some nuance to that. People always forget that he's very deliberately using the term opiate because opiates are painkillers. And so he's aware that what it does is to dampen or diminish also radical pain of the underclasses. Nevertheless, he's disdainful of religion for this reason, but nevertheless, he sees that as its function. But here, we have something different. We don't have religion. We have something that's kind of partakes of the same absurd, illogic leap of logic, the leap of faith that Kierkegaard talks about in religion, but without any of the claims to universality or absolutism that religion possesses. Instead, you get all the power of religion in its magicality without any of the belief system that needs to go into it, right? So it's cool. It's nice to be able to extract the marrow of metaphysics without all the baggage, right? You know, all the God play and all that. And that should be fascinating to you as well, because superstitions, if rumors are words that have no origin, superstition is also a miracle without origin. So you don't need a God to explain why a superstition works. It's almost a faith in spontaneity, right? That it just spontaneously emerges that way or works that way. You don't need to believe that there are actors, especially anthropomorphic actors, behind the scenes. You follow, that make superstition work the way that miracle does. Miracle tends to have an authored metaphysical center, right? There's a God who lets the miracle or authorizes the miracle, endorses the miracle, predestines the miracle. Superstition just happens to be a crack in the wall that one incidentally stumbles upon. But then that's an interesting question. How do you incidentally stumble upon a superstitious logic? Through trial and error, which means that there are people who are either so desperate, and that's what the reason I connected it to religion is that if Marx said religion is the opiate of the masses, this is the weapon of the most immiserated members of society. It's the last resort. It's the last recourse, right? If you think about it, it's a desperate attempt to find a way of navigating against extreme deterministic odds that are set against you, right? So, but yeah, imagine the person who's sitting in a room in their solitude, trying out testing a million different combinations of gestures, of ingredients, of movements, all to just try and hit the lottery with one. And then, of course, the law of probability is that eventually you'll flip the right coin, sort of, and then you have to convince yourself that it was no accident, that it was no just sort of simple likelihood, but that it works. You know, everybody knows this in gambling too. You go on streaks, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting. For religion to be true, it has to be 100% true all the time. For a superstition to be operative, notice that a lot of people will still believe in it even when it fails, right? So if it clicks, if it hits, this becomes the interesting ratio. I suspect, and this is my own readings of these things over time, that while you would think that, okay, it's got to hit 8 out of 10 times to convince somebody that the superstition is actually effective, weirdly enough, it could be 7, 6, 5. Now, this is where we get to the crossing point, the breaking point. What if it only works half the time? Which is to say, it's kind of in that 50-50 shot of general probability anyway, heads or tails, right? Is it still considered a kind of magical advantage? Yes, but here's the best part. I've seen superstitions that fail constantly. I'm talking 2 out of 10 hit, and they're still upheld. Now that becomes interesting, right? When you're in the negative domain of efficacy, but there's still energy behind it. Now the question is, what narratives? We know, what did the Communist Party of the Soviet Union say to the people when they resigned in the 1980s? You know, it wasn't a massive revolution that ended this huge communist experiment in the Soviet. This Communist Party itself resigned from history, which is a bizarre, I mean, look at how dictators usually go out swinging, killing all their people, you know, before they're finally torn apart in the streets. Not the Communist Party, they suicided themselves, saying, sorry, we tried, you know, and we hit a wall. We're clearly mismanaging things. Clearly the dream has not materialized. We're going to take a nap now, right? That's interesting. How does an ideology subside is an interest. How does it admit its own failure? How does a religion admit when it's failed? Can it admit that? But the interesting thing is, or how does it rebound or try to justify when it fails? For instance, the Child's Crusade, when the church of the medieval era marched thousands of children to go to war against the Muslims and killed those children in a river, basically brought them to a river that had flooded.